Hello, good afternoon. It is a pleasure as a president of Barcelona Centre Financer Europeu for Sustainability to welcome to all participants that they are following this webinar focused on a topic that we consider that is becoming more and more important for the financial centers to focus on, nature and biodiversity finance. This webinar has been possible to organize thanks to the cooperation of the Financial Centers for Sustainability, FC4S, international network, that made possible to have with us one of the most relevant experts of this field, Mark Hall, that will give us a wide approach to what's the actual situation, as well as which are the lines of the activity to be taken by the financial centers on the near future about this matter. And this has been reflected on the Davos conference. My sincere gratitude is to him for his absolute disposition from the first moment to participate on the webinar, as well to the FC4S for their cooperation. Without both of it, wouldn't be possible to be here today. I would also to thank to all of you that are following the webinar, hoping that it will be useful for you and that it will accomplish your expectations and that it will give you as reason enough to organize future activities about the same topic. Finally, I want to thank to Josep Soler, CEO of the Financial Studies Institute, IEF, a member of the Executive Committee of Barcelona Centre Financer Europeu for Sustainability, for his ability from the first moment to act as moderator of the webinar. With no more delay, I give the floor to Josep Soler, that will introduce you Mark Hall and will moderate the question and answer session later on. Thank you very much. Josep, the floor is yours.
Thank you to everybody. Thanks, Luis, to give me the floor. It's a pleasure to, let's say, to start, because it's a little bit our birth on biodiversity finance, for Barcelona Centre Financer Europeu for Sustainability. Then it's a pleasure to make this kind of introduction to this birth of our presence and our knowledge and our activity in a part of sustainability finance which is much less known and apply, I will say, that what is related to climate change. I think biodiversity finance is acquiring an importance in everything related to ESG and sustainable finance, and we have to know what it's all about and in which way we can operate on that. Then it will be an excellent introductory conference lecture, and especially done by a person which all those who are related with the financial centers network on sustainable finance knows that is the right person to do this introductory lecture to the Financial Center of Barcelona. Let me, before to introduce Mark Hall, which is our lecturer today, as I said, let me also thank Kennedy Massey, another expert at the Financial Center for Sustainability Network, and of course the staff of the network, which are always helping each of the centers in order to get more information, know more how do we act in these in the different fields of financial sustainability, and then in general doing what the network was organized for doing, which is the cooperation between all these financial centers who are trying to increase our activity and our presence in ESG and sustainable finance. Well, as I said, thanks, Mark, to make this presentation in Barcelona. As a matter of fact, in a few days, you are doing a very similar presentation for the network itself. And but Barcelona has already thought several months ago that we wanted to do this for us in May, And the first thing is many thanks to Mark Hall for that. Well, Mark stayed 2 years in the diplomatic secretariat of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, and has devoted his entire career to environment and sustainable development. He spent 4 years in the World Wildlife Fund International Conservation Division. He had at that moment responsibility for building programs in China, and as a conservation advisor in the UK. He left IUCN to establish the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Europe, which he directed until retirement in 2016, and where he remains a senior fellow. Mark was also a senior advisor to the United Nations Environment Programme inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system for the 4 years of its mandate. He has helped establish and is still senior advisor to the International Network of Financial Centers for Sustainability, the FCS4S, that Barcelona is one of the members, and I believe one of the oldest members in this moment. He's also a principal of the Finance for the Diversity Initiative, and is presently establishing a global center for nature finance. You know that sometimes referring to biodiversity finance, sometimes we are referring to nature finance, but in any way, it's what we can consider more the same part of sustainable finance. He's co-founder also of Better Nature, a partnership that focuses on narrative development. Finally, we can say that Mark is a chairman of the board of Traffic International, the world's leading wildlife trade organization. He sits on the board of also Sustainable Finance Geneva, another colleagues, another members in the international network. We could stay presenting Mark biography for hours at least, but I think what we want is to listen to him. As I said, he is going to make us an excellent, and I said that he's excellent because I hear already Mark, and I know his presentation, and it's of extremely interest to understand really from him what biodiversity finance, what nature finance is, and what new frontier this part of sustainable finance is. Nothing else. At the end of the presentation of Mark, we will have some question time. We already received from different people invited some questions, and I think also the question time will be of interest to end up this webinar, which not apparently, but in reality, will be of an incredible interest for the people that we have started recently in understanding what biodiversity finance is. Thank you, Mark. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josep. My only regret in doing this is that I'm not with you in Barcelona. That would have been really a perfect combination. But I'm very glad to respond to your initiative, and I congratulate you for putting this on the agenda so quickly. I think every financial center needs to come to grips with the new challenges and opportunities presented by biodiversity finance, and I'm glad to see Barcelona taking a lead in this respect. You mentioned my long biography, and I should have sent something much shorter because really it covers a great deal of a great span of years. But two things you will have noted from it. The first is that I began my career on the environment side, and I ended it with sustainable development policy, and in particular finance. And so it's a great luxury to combine my two passions, one for nature and one for the way the financial system works in such a way. Now, you mentioned that I was in Davos earlier this week, and I just want to tell you two things about Davos. First, whatever you think of the World Economic Forum, it's very widely considered to be a barometer of political issues or new economic or technical or policy issues. So if something emerges from the World Economic Forum, it means that it is making its way high up on the political agenda. And I can tell you one thing: the entire time I was in Davos earlier this week, I could have gone from one biodiversity finance event to another without having any gaps in between on the program. And I think what that tells you is that this is an issue that has made it onto the mainstream, onto the main political agenda, and therefore all financial centers are going to have to find a way of dealing with it. It's not very long ago, I'm sure you all remember, where nature finance was considered a sort of boutique operation for those who had a particular feeling for nature or wild animals. And even in the world of impact finance, it was only a very tiny proportion of the money invested. So it was a small topic. Everybody was trying to get to grips with climate change. And in the case of nature, it was something that people didn't understand, didn't pay much attention to, and certainly didn't build into their own operations. I can say today, only a few years later, that biodiversity finance has penetrated the entire spectrum in financial and capital markets. It's a topic of concern to central banks, monetary policy, financial supervision. It is a key topic being looked at by institutional investors like sovereign wealth funds, pensions, and insurances, and right across to the financial services industry, the rating agencies, those setting norms, and those providing data services. So it has penetrated the entire spectrum, which is, of course, very good news for those who are trying to come to grips with the topic. What we are seeing now is that biodiversity finance is emerging as a key part, a plank or a beam of the solution architecture on striking the balance between the perfectly legitimate pursuit of profit, but also the need to protect the public good, such as controlling climate change and ensuring that biodiversity is not lost at a faster pace than it is at present. So it's now, it's really about how you allocate capital to biodiversity priorities and how you amend the rules that govern the financial system to ensure that that happens. I think it's fair to say that we will reverse current negative biodiversity trends only if biodiversity becomes genuinely material to financial decision making. The performance of financial actors in respect of nature has to really matter, has to have really serious consequences on their profitability and on their social acceptance if we're going to really align finance with nature. So let me just give you something you all know. It's 30 years now since the Rio Earth Summit, which the Secretary General Maurice Strong called the last chance to save the planet. And in those 30 years, despite the adoption of the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992, we have seen not only continued biodiversity loss, but that loss is on an accelerating trend. The science, just like in the case of climate and IPCC, is now absolutely incontrovertible. There is no doubt that we are entering the sixth great extinction, and unless we change course, there will be very grim consequences on the planet, but as you will soon see, also on the economy and on finance. And I'm sorry to say that instead of responding to the crisis with greater political will, it appears that political will is shrinking rather than growing. At the same time, of course, public demand for action on nature is increasing, and we'll come back to that later in the presentation. So as you probably know, there is a formal intergovernmental negotiation on biodiversity. They continue to set goals and targets, and in 2010, they set 20 targets to be achieved by 2020. I think all you need to know is they achieved none of those targets. And the ones where there was partial progress are those soft ones like knowledge transfer that can be debated but don't actually change reality. And it matters that these goals and these targets are not achieved. The failure at present is calculated at $140 billion worth of nature-based services per year. And if we don't act, that could grow tenfold so that by 2050, losses of worth 14 trillion US dollars, or the equivalent of 7% of world GDP, could be a reality. So I think it's important to understand that it's not simply that nature lovers like to see green around them. There are very serious consequences on the economy and on investment if we do not address those. Now, most people in the past have looked at biodiversity needs and said, well, we're not putting enough money into protecting nature. We're not putting enough money into managing ecosystems. And although we are increasing in that respect, that's not where the main problem lies. In 2019, we spent between 124 and 143 billion dollars per year on activities that benefit biodiversity. And that is a near tripling in funding since 2012. So people are concerned and people are expending. The problem is that at the same time, our governments are spending on subsidies 4 times the amount, that they're spending to nature positive activities in undermining nature. So public funding is pulling nature down rather than restoring it. We've made calculations of the current gap in funding, and there's a clear need for something in the order of $824 billion a year simply to meet the priorities set out for stabilization and restoration of nature and ecosystems that serve our economy and our businesses. So let's look at this from a perspective of both risk and opportunity. What is the risk if we don't take the action needed? Well, the World Economic Forum, the organizers of Davos, estimate that 44 trillion worth of global output is at risk due to the decline of nature and ecosystems. And other governments who made calculations along these lines come up with similar results. And if you look at the global risk report that WEF puts out every year, biodiversity consistently ranks at the top of business concerns. So this is not simply NGOs and the public that are worried about nature loss. Businesses see what's coming, see the risks inherent in not addressing nature, and have elevated this to a very, very high ranking, up there with climate change and international security. At the same time, though, you can look at it a different way. Just like we looked at the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy as not only something that would do wonders to climate, but that also create job opportunities and investment opportunities, the same is true in biodiversity. World Economic Forum estimates that there are opportunities worth $10 trillion in investment relating to restoration of biodiversity, and that this could create 395 million jobs globally. So if you don't like nature, if you don't care about nature and care only about the economy, it is nevertheless worth it to invest in restoration of nature for straight economic reasons. But in fact, it's true that all GDP is dependent on nature's service. And we're reaching a stage where valuing nature risk at zero is absolutely not possible any longer. We know that if we go on this way, business models will fail, investments will fail, and not only nature degradation will be the consequences. So I'd like to illustrate where we are, I think, in the development of biodiversity finance by looking at 5 topics. And they are necessarily somewhat mechanical because we are putting in place the basic foundation stones and the basic architecture of our ability to deal with nature in financial institutions. The first is the rapid progress being made in disclosure and transparency. So if we don't know what companies are doing, if we don't know the impact that they have on nature, it is very difficult for us to help them build natural capital and nature risk into their business models. So the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, set up a year and a half ago, is moving forward very, very quickly, putting in place the building blocks necessary to enable us not only to build nature into our operations, but also to understand the risks inherent and the impacts that are being achieved with those investments. So investors need to know, in terms of investing in companies, what is the nature-related risk and what is the impact that company has? To what extent is it dependent on services from nature for the investment success to be realized? And so there you have a sample of some of the things that the TNFD are doing. Now, the TNFD in March of this year, unveiled its beta version. And it very deliberately put out something that was not completely thought through, simply because it wanted to test the market and see what ways people thought of this and how they reacted to the growing requirements to be transparent and to disclose. And the difference between TNFD and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures a few years ago is that they're not only looking at risks and dependencies, but they're also looking at the impact of corporations on biodiversity, and not simply as a result of financial investment. So we are now in a consultation period. There's broad socializing of the beta version across communities, across indigenous groups, to see what the reaction is, to see whether they more or less got it right. And of course, as a voluntary standard, TNFD, as with TCFD, could be slow to take root. There is a risk that many corporations who are benefiting from at present from ignoring biodiversity risks will resist any new obligations of transparency and disclosure being placed on them. And there is, of course, the standard risk that we always have, that some large corporations will find it rather easy to comply with the new standards, and there'll be large gaps between the large and small companies, and being, of course, companies in the richer parts of the world and those in emerging economies. But there's already a very positive policy response, particularly in the European Union, where the European Commission approved a new statistical framework to better account for biodiversity in national economic planning and in putting together an enabling national policy framework. And the response of policymakers to TNFD has also been very positive. They see this as something that is a really essential piece of the architecture if we are going to be able to build nature risk into our investment programs, into our corporate operations. And the European Commission released, as you know, an action plan on sustainable finance in 2018, and it is very strong on enhancing non-financial information disclosure along with the disclosure requirements that are already in place. So I believe that financial centers like Barcelona really need to ensure that they are able to help their stakeholders understand not only the forthcoming obligations, but also the opportunities that lie on that in that. And I think it would be very useful if members of your financial center could go onto the TNFD interactive platform and provide some feedback on it. So very closely related is the question of data. We all know that in trying to come to grips with biodiversity risk in corporate or financial actions, you come up very quickly on a lack of data, or a lack of coherent data, or very patchy data, or data that's not comparable. And this is genuinely a limitation, and it's one that people are struggling to fulfill. But it's clear that as the Credit Suisse found, that 70% of investors consider the lack of available data as a really key barrier in doing what they would otherwise like to do and invest more in biodiversity. So it's important that we start, of course, with regulation like TNFD that demands greater transparency and greater disclosure, and therefore greater availability of data. But it's also, I think, important to understand that the whole world of finance and biodiversity science is mobilizing to try and provide the necessary tools and metrics. So, for example, the biodiversity footprint for financial institutions measures the impact of financial institutions' activities on nature. The Global Biodiversity Score, developed by CDC in France, is a data tool that helps businesses install methodologies and approaches that build biodiversity into their action. The Encore tool is also one that is developed for banking institutions. And of course, there are new service providers like Nature Alpha that have been set up to guide companies on how to implement biodiversity strategies, even while waiting for better or more complete data to come on stream. So there's a huge amount of action happening here. It's also happening, of course, in the public sector. And the Dutch central bank, of course, looked systematically at the risk facing the financial sector from a loss of biodiversity. And this is quite interesting because central banks generally have kept out of that kind of sectoral policy. And if they're in it, is because they also see the trends that are taking place. They also see the dependency of nature on finance and investment on nature, and consider that nature degradation could form a prudential risk that is very much the mandate of central banks. 36% of investments by Dutch financial institutions are deemed to be very highly dependent on one or more ecosystem service. So this is a very large part of the financial investment that is linked to nature and therefore vulnerable to nature degradation. And other central banks like those in France have started to analyze the biodiversity impact of their asset portfolios. And so on data, there's a need obviously for greater access, but what we need is really a kind of open access data platform in the pre-competitive space that is between the raw data that's available and the kind of investor grade data that you might find on a Bloomberg or a Refinitiv terminal. And of course, we have to continue to make data protocols more homogeneous to ensure greater ease at comparability, and so that countries and institutions and financial players can use them much more readily. So moving on to another very important development, and actually Tuesday night there was a very high-level dinner in Davos about nature positive, with ministers, prime ministers, with corporate leaders, with science leaders, and there was a real agreement that, like we have a net zero norm in climate change, we need a similar norm in nature, but that we are not going to be satisfied with no net loss of nature. We want financial activity to be restorative, to actually be nature positive. And so there is a scramble now to develop a robust standard that will help us help us adopt a nature positive standard. And one can imagine as it comes out that it can increasingly be a requirement for doing business, for public acceptability of financial institutions. For example, governments could make adherence to the nature positive standard a condition for participating in public procurement, or banks could make it a condition for access to credit. The nature positive norm is a real shift, looking at unlocking the 10 trillion of business opportunities in nature that I mentioned before, and in particular addressing the three economic systems that are responsible for most nature loss, which are, of course, agriculture, land use, infrastructure, and energy. And we can imagine that the combination of net zero and nature positive could become the essential algorithm of our time, similar to new norms that excluded child labor or slavery from supply chains. Something similar could very well come. What we need to do is to close the gap in nature positive financial activity, for example, by reducing perverse subsidies, by extending legal liability for biodiversity damage to the financial community, for accelerating what's already happening in the recognition of the legal standing of nature, so that nature damage can be brought to court and awarded redress for harm. And then new forms of corporate governance. And I think a most interesting example is a corporation in New Zealand who placed an advocate for nature on their corporate board. And I think we will see, as we are seeing in climate, a widened use of litigation, people taking corporations to court, or even governments to court, to sue for damages done to climate and soon biodiversity. And we're seeing also public sector action, such as the UK's development of a new requirement on due diligence for corporations to ensure that their entire value chain is deforestation free. These are positive examples of what's happening. Another area that is developing very, very quickly is the use of new financial instruments. And we are all, I'm sure, familiar with green bonds, with blue bonds, with SDG bonds promoted by UNDP. and to a ever wider range of sustainability-linked bonds. We are currently looking at one that seems to have particular promise, and that is something that we call a nature performance bond. And the advantage of it is that the benefit from the bond comes only after the nature performance has been achieved. So a country, for example, an indebted country like Pakistan, will do a deal with a creditor such as the UK to say that we will achieve the following nature performance indicators. And as we achieve the milestones, you'll release the capital on the bond so we can use it in our financial processes. And two of the special features of nature performance bonds are, first of all, that there is no need for mistrust, because the bond is only released as the performances are achieved and certified. But secondly, unlike other things like debt for nature swaps, only a small proportion of the bond needs to go to achieving the nature performance, and the rest can be used by the country through its normal budget process. Example that we're working on, I mentioned before, is Pakistan, where they have set up indicators around tree planting and ecological rehabilitation. And the idea is that nature performance bond would reward the speeding up and extension of government programs in this area, but also relate to a set of secondary indicators like rural employment, community participation, capacity building, and many others. And it would the ultimate outcome of this would not only be to release new funding into the Pakistan economy, but because that money is a result of investing in the building up of natural capital, that in itself would lower the risk profile that Pakistan faces in international capital markets, and thereby lower the cost of capital. So it's very much a kind of win-win solution where you advance nature or climate goals and also give a highly indebted country access to capital at preferential rates. And finally, my last example is that of fintech, digital financial technology. And this is an area that's hard to speak about because it is exploding so quickly. It's certainly developing far beyond the ability of governments to regulate it. So we have to be very, very careful, because technology approaches that can be used to do good can also be used to do bad, and we have to ensure that our regulations channel funding into the positive applications. But I think it's very clear that there are two main things that we can count on from application of fintech. One is a certain amount of disintermediation, so that citizens can interact directly with nature or with communities or with projects on the ground without having to go through the long process of financial intermediation. Also, of course, it can allow projects that are not of interest to traditional financial innovators because they're too small. They are small or medium enterprises, or they have a low cost of capital, to be put onto the market and dealt with. And of course, the second thing is that they speed up the rate of transactions while building trust in the value of those transactions. And if you look at this slide, there are so many examples there of what's already happening, what's moving very quickly. I'll only use one to illustrate this, and that is the case of Ant Financial in China. Now, Ant Financial is a company that runs the Alipay online purchase platform, part of the Alibaba group. Now, what they did is to create an algorithm that calculates your nature and climate footprint on the basis of your purchase record. So if you have purchased 1,000 items on the Alipay platform, they can calculate exactly what your climate and now biodiversity footprint is as a result of those purchases. And they encourage you, they challenge you to lower that footprint through your purchasing record and help you to do it. So this is direct citizen action, direct crowdsourcing, direct action by individuals or groups of individuals that has the result of lowering the carbon footprint of consumption and lowering the nature footprint of consumption. And the Ant Financial application now has over 500 million users. Now, of course, China is an enormous country and you can get things on that scale, but it shows what you can do with purely private initiative in the climate and biodiversity space. I should just tell you also that as you achieve a certain amount of lowering of your footprint, Ali Ant Financial will plant a tree in Inner Mongolia for you. And this has now been going for a number of years, and they have an obligation to plant something like 100 million trees to regreen parts of Inner Mongolia. And in fact, if you're an individual, they will send you the geo-reference of your tree and you can go actually visit it. So let me just talk about some of the things that we need to do around fintech. I mentioned the struggle to provide relevant regulation guidance and policy clarity. And so there's a need to share best practice, to create sort of policy sandboxes which can unlock the good that fintech can do while screening out the more negative uses of it. We need to ensure that the data sets on which these depend remain in the public sector. So one example is the need to make public the data coming from Earth observation systems rather than allowing those to be privatized and sold to users on a commercial basis. And there are efforts in the United Nations to do that. And finally, that fintech platforms need to work with regulators to ensure that the private sector uses and the critical role that they have in mobilizing citizen action are enabled and encouraged. So just let me close by saying that I could probably go on for a few more hours. I've given examples in 5 areas of a very rapid development in the field of biodiversity finance, some of the elements, the building blocks that are coming together. But let me also say that there are a lot of other things happening or beginning to happen in this space, and they were evident in Davos. And one I mentioned before, which is the Network for the Greening of the Financial System, which gathers something like 98 central banks and financial supervisors, so that they are together looking at how they can fulfill their mandates to avoid biodiversity loss as a prudential challenge by giving guidance and new ideas and new approaches to their members. And of course, 98 central banks is a very powerful group. There's also, of course, a new interest, very rapidly emerging interest in nature markets. We see nature markets being the future of agriculture and food production. And the war in Ukraine and the ripple effects that it's had on the food system has really forced people to completely rethink their sort of supply chains, their just-in-time delivery policies, the value of the industrialized food production system, which depends on fertilizers and pesticides and agricultural chemicals. And it's triggering the very rapid development of alternatives such as vertical farming and alternative protein, which are, of course, all investment opportunities that the smart players will get out in front of. And finally, at Davos, I attended a meeting where they floated this idea of biocredits. A group called Replanet is trying to develop these. And the idea is simply that if you invest in an uplift of biodiversity, you achieve a credit, say 1% improvement of the nature impact of your value chain will give you 1 biocredit. And these credits can be elements in offset systems. They can be traded on financial markets and so on. And so what we're seeing overall is that the problem we had in the past, which was that biodiversity was important, nature was important, people were concerned about the loss of nature and biodiversity, but it wasn't material to financial decision making. What we're seeing now is for all of these reasons, and many, many more, biodiversity risk is becoming highly material in financial decision making and in corporate behavior. And we're on an accelerating curve to ensure that is mainstream and that nature positive behavior becomes a condition of doing business, a condition of participating in the financial system. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and over to you for questions and answers.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark. If I could summarize your presentation, I will say that you opened so many windows for further research, for further acquiring of knowledge. I will say even for professional dedication to different areas. I mean, what biodiversity and nature finance is saying in front of us is there is a large number of opportunities there, and I think professionals, both of sustainability and of finance itself, have with biodiversity finance, with nature finance, an incredible number of issues, areas to devote time and work, and also, why not, trying to get opportunities. I mean, this is not, that is clear with your presentation, that is not anymore a kind of starting emerging debate, but this is already a reality, something that has the fundamentals to be taken not only seriously, but intensively. The targets are more clear. There are risks and opportunities and challenges for financial centers, for financial stakeholders, a lot of work to do. TNFD is already very important for reporting, for have a serious base in which analyze and value everything. But of course, the challenge of data and developing data is already there and it needs to be improved. Fintech is, I will say, offering an incredible number of possibilities to re-establish instruments for finance and investing in nature finance. I think the concept of restorative finance helps us, or it helps some of us to understand that we don't need to look in that case to a zero emission situation in some years, but in nature we need to look to this concept of restorative finance for nature positive objective, which are really the most important way of looking at. Well, tech for the biodiversity is very important, both for data, for instruments. We have already ways to go in innovative biodiversity finance. You mentioned some of them. Always incentive, behavioral finance. I think looking incentives in behavioral finance is important. I mean, we need to internalize this cost of natural externalization, fintech, digital converting finance. You mentioned other instruments, biocredits, nature performance bonds. We have already a lot of for doing. Then it's that was more. What it was get more surprise to me when I listened to you, Mark, for first time, because my wrong understanding is that we were looking more in theory already. But I realize completely, and I think it's important that we all realize that biodiversity finance has a lot of possibilities for becoming a central issue in finance very, very, very soon. And I hope also in sustainability. Then thank you very much again, Mark. And we have already some questions, both from the public and private sector. Let me start by the question of José María Sánchez, which is the General Director of Financial Policy in the government of Catalonia. Question of José María is, how can regional and local governments help to improve the financial centers' activity and their territories' activities in terms of nature finance? How you see these local and regional administrations pushing for that?
So I think, and I didn't say this, but I implied it in my talk, that if you are convinced that nature finance is becoming a central pillar of international financial activity, then it should be in the interest of a financial center like Barcelona to get out ahead of the game. In other words, there are first mover opportunities that Barcelona can achieve, and other slower financial centers will have to scramble to follow. So I think that's a combination of sort of public sector action, institutional action, and action by the financial actors. So the public sector action, what you want more than anything else is a favorable policy and regulatory framework. And so to the extent that the policy and regulatory framework is the responsibility of the autonomous regional government, then they should be examining those things. The second thing that they should be doing is looking at the incentives built into the tax system, built into current regulations, that have the contrary effect. In climate change, we talk about the continuation of several $100 billion worldwide of fossil fuel subsidies. And if you think about it, that's tax money being used to undermine climate goals. So it's voters and citizens whose money is being used by their government to take us in a direction that's completely the opposite of what we have publicly committed to do. And so I think a review of the impact on biodiversity and on climate of current government activity would be very, very good. And then finally, of course, the most successful financial centers are those where the financial actors work hand in hand with the regulators and the government. We see this in Paris, for example, where the new climate law that the French government adopted was developed as a kind of dialogue between key business leaders and the government. And we make the mistake of saying that private sector doesn't like to be regulated. The private sector was begging to be regulated because it gave more predictability. It gave those who have the ability to introduce the technology an advantage. And so I think there needs to be a group perhaps formed by your financial center authority and the regional government to see what needs to be put in place to make Barcelona a really successful leader in the area of biodiversity finance. There are institutional issues, there are capacity issues, there are data issues, there are all of those, but none of them are impossible to solve, and even in a short time if you do it correctly.
Thank you, Marc. We have a couple of questions from Ana Garcia. Ana Garcia is the chair of the Committee on Economy and Sustainability at the College of Economists of Catalonia. First question, Ana is worried about the valuation of natural capital. What relationship or impact will it have on financial assets? Or should we ask, could have on financial assets?
So this is what I call the materiality question. And so up until recently, it was possible simply to discount nature, give it a zero value, simply because you were getting its services at no charge. But the problem with that is that you are dependent on sound ecosystems and ecosystem services for your value chains. And therefore, if they degrade, your level of risk and your level of investment risk also goes up. So what's happening now is that there's an understanding that the zero valuation of nature is a thing of the past and has to be a thing of the past. And so people are struggling on how to build nature risk into their financial calculations, their risk return calculations. And so that's happening very, very quickly, and a whole army of financial service providers is developing to offer those services.
Marc, do you think that it will prevail a little bit more the double valuation? Let's say we have a financial valuation of that asset, that company, and at the same time we are going to have a kind of nature valuation of that company, or that should be integrated? I mean,
We've tried over many years to have a sort of parallel set of books that took into account the impact on nature and the dependency on nature, and it simply doesn't work. I mean, any corporation knows that the basic balance sheet is what's looked at by investors. The risk profile is what's looked at investors. And so I think that there is no choice but to fully integrate it. And I think that's the process that's happening now. We've seen it happen already with climate risk. And climate risk now, I don't know a financial institution that's in any way serious that would say, oh, well, we kind of ignore climate. The government's dealing with that. They know perfectly well that climate risk is a factor in their business planning. And the same is happening very quickly with nature.
Sorry to go to something which is not so nice, but do we have already a bit of nature washing?
Yes, of course. I mean, if you introduce new obligations on those who haven't had to deal with them before, I think the first step is to try and ignore them. So, for example, when the United States introduced the National Environmental Protection Act, it was widely ignored for a number of years, and then it was widely complied with very quickly. The difference between the first and the second was that moment when the cost of complying fell below the cost of not complying. And so I think, with any new standard, the attempt is to ignore it. And then when it becomes clear that ignoring it is a more costly strategy, corporations are innovative, they're creative, they're experimental, they can quickly adapt to a new situation. And so I think that we are in a stage where the data is still too patchy, the taxonomies are not fully in place, the definitions vary from one country to another, and therefore businesses who wish to give the impression that they're doing something for nature but aren't doing so really will use those loopholes to avoid action. And that's why a tight, scientifically based nature positive norm is something that we need to develop very quickly.
Thank you. In the Barcelona City Council, they were, I think it's very interesting, the Irma Ventallol, which is in charge of the Office of Sustainability, make questions together with Pau Batalla, which is the Director of Finance, Budget Management and Tax Authority. Then people coming from two different, completely different offices but that they are, through what we are talking, are forced to understand themselves. Well, they put the questions together, and I think this is interesting. First question is, biodiversity loss and the climate crisis are the focus of many socio-environmental challenges. And we know that nature-based solutions offer the potential to solve interconnected crises. In this regard, how can we accelerate the mobilization of billions of dollars on investment to address the global socio-ecological crisis? Who do you think should be the key players at the international and local levels?
So what we've seen, you're familiar with this in Catalonia and in Spain, that government pleads poverty and that budget allocations are very difficult to come by, complex political process to get them allocated. And then something happens like COVID. And all of a sudden, billions and trillions are expended. But let's first get away from this idea that the money isn't there. The money is there. It's just a question of how it's allocated. We have seen the United States respond to the Russian invasion of Ukraine by allocating just trillions of dollars of money. Now, you can argue whether that's money well spent or not, but the fact is that it's there. And if we were able to consider the climate crisis or the nature crisis as having the same urgency and the same immediacy as for example, the war in Ukraine, then I have no doubt that public funding could be allocated. What I think we're also seeing is that we are developing ways in which, and nature-based solutions is one way, of finding solutions that are profitable to the private sector, but also address climate and nature priorities. And the importance of those and the rapid growth, for example, of nature markets, I think is for any smart investor is something that they want to look at because it'll emerge really, really quickly. And so one of my regrets is when I was a student, I didn't invest in Microsoft or in Google. I think there are a lot of people who wish that they had invested in in nature market startups or nature data providers or whatever at a time when you could still do so very cheaply. I predict that this is a change that will be coming much more quickly than any of us expect.
Let me see if some of these disappointed with crypto assets these days, maybe listening to you, no? Maybe it will be positive. You are coming from Davos, and you told us that well, it was quite an incredible interest in conference and debates on that. But did you listen about promises of or compromises, real compromises on investment in that field?
So I think several things are evident. One is that corporations and financial players accept that they cannot operate in a way that destroys the climate or destroys nature. That's now sort of broadly accepted. It's not broadly implemented, but for example, in the climate area, it's increasingly evident that we have to get beyond coal, and that getting beyond coal will mean putting a lot of money to simply buying down the coal industry. And so we are facing this kind of choice, and the banks and others are looking at it very carefully. They're also looking at how to transform the food and agriculture system around the world, because under present scenarios, there will be enormous food shortages, and that will trigger civil unrest in fragile countries. And of course, the streams of immigrants coming to our shores that we have seen over the past couple decades, but which will swell enormously. So in a sense, the question is not, can we afford, can banks afford, can financial players, can investors afford to invest in nature, invest in climate action? The question is, can they afford not to? And I think that the answer that's coming out very quickly is no, we can't. We can't afford not to do that. And we're it was very interesting that corporate social responsibility was the watchword 10 years ago. Nobody talks about it anymore. They now talk about ESG, but ESG is very rapidly going out the window. And what we're talking about now is genuine impact. And so all the articles that came out about ESG being a form of greenwash are absolutely accurate. They are. And what we need now is to say, it's simply not acceptable to conduct business in a way that pumps carbon into the atmosphere or destroys fragile ecosystems. It's simply not acceptable. And that if you continue to do that, you will lose your social license to operate. And what's interesting is that the liability that corporations face is slowly extending to the financial players. So what if banks were legally liable for the environmental damage done by a corporation to which they made a loan? That would change risk calculation very fundamentally.
Okay, we are not going to take much time because our compromise was to finish around 7 o'clock. But Marga de Rosselló, which is Director of Sustainability, Corporate Responsibility and Climate Change in PricewaterhouseCoopers here in Barcelona, a member of our steering committee, makes a couple of questions that I will, if she allows me, I will change moderately. She's asking which are the sectors or project categories that are currently attracting more investment in terms of financing nature, which are the ones that are generating more interest among investors and why. And I will say, do we have really some example, I should say, some example of best practice, something that was already took the investment, changed the environment or changed the nature, and can we use as an example of a success, no? Of a specific project, or we need to wait, or we have to wait for that?
There are many examples at a small scale, and I think that perhaps the two most interesting areas have to do with the combination of restoration of degraded land and regenerative farming. So that we know that in Africa, for example, there are 100 million hectares of degraded land. And that land is naturally fertile and very often connected to water sources, but has been allowed to degrade. So the potential to regenerate those lands and those ecosystems in ways that provide employment, in ways that provide the kind of that put in place the kind of agriculture that doesn't destroy soils, is a subject of absolutely enormous interest. So I mentioned those nature performance bonds. There's a big interest in Africa and the Sahel in particular in saying, could we use nature performance bonds to regenerate through activities that both allow land productivity to increase, but also biodiversity to increase. And the second example I'll give is that of natural infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure. There's a need all around the developing world for a lot of investment in infrastructure, and of course it's big ticket investment. But there are ways to invest that are friendly to nature or use nature as a form of a natural infrastructure. So that we know, for example, that mangroves and coral reefs protect the coastline from erosion, that they act as fish nurseries and support fisheries in the open oceans. And so you can invest in nature services as a form of natural infrastructure in a way that actually builds back ecosystems. The traditional answer you get from infrastructure companies is, or those that finance them, is that yes, but natural infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure is more expensive than the alternative. Well, I think that's no longer true, but there's also a way around it. You can define your project as a nature-friendly project and then ask for a competitive bidding process for that particular project. You don't have to say, well, we'll build a road, we'll just bulldoze the landscape and lay down some concrete. You can say, no, here are the characteristics of the road that we want, and go through your normal bidding process. So I think a lot of those things are now happening and being experimented with.
Second question of Marga, I think you already answered that, the importance of the role of impact valuation methodologies and to develop that more. No, I think it's that's something that we need to do, even to improve more. No, that systems of measure the impact.
Yes, very much so. But in the slide that I showed, I gave examples of several tools that are now available. The Encore tool, for example, which is available to banks that they can imply, and probably the banks in Barcelona are already using it and applying it. But it allows banks to calculate the impact. The public finance organizations, public banks, development banks are beginning to develop methodologies to assess their portfolios. And, you know, they have portfolios that together amount to $1 trillion. So this is not inconsiderable. When you look at what the sovereign wealth funds are doing, like the Norwegian Pension Fund, which is the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, they have excluded, they've divested in an increasing series of areas that are negative to climate change and negative to biodiversity. So I think what we will see is, for example, fishery fleets that deplete fisheries will not only lose investment, but they'll lose insurance cover as well. And so we're moving to a point where international institutions, in particular institutional asset owners, are taking the kind of action at scale that will shift the whole market very quickly to the other side. If you can still hear me, I realize we've gone over time. Perhaps Angel Tello can come on and help us with the closing.
Thank you, Mark. We thank you for your time and thank you for giving us this exposition. That, as Josep Soler said, we have realize how much it has to be done, and that's something that in an activity that we are still starting, but there are a lot of challenges to do. Thank you very much, Mark, for your time. And I want also to thank you to FC4S to making possible through your contribution today. And I'm sure that we will find the possibilities to repeat it and to go further in explore all these topics. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for all the attendees or all the people that you have been with us today from your home or your work, and hoping that it has been so interesting for you, or so fine for you what we have seen. Thank you very much to all of you, and you will find the record of this webinar in our website, and we will distribute also that everybody that would want again or to check it, you could do it. Thank you, and again, thanks, Mark, again for your time. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you.
Gracias y hasta luego.
Gracias, Mark. Bye bye.